ship left on the dock for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Welcome to Sacred Cow Shipyards.
So I was hanging out with my minions the other day, and I do this occasionally. I mean, come on, I'm not always a capricious, uncaring overlord. I know they have feelings, otherwise they wouldn't be able to identify whether or not they had been damaged, and it really reduces efficiency at the shipyards when one of the minions had been damaged. So, of course they have feelings, and I try to work with those as best I can, as much as I care about it, which is not very often. But anyways, moving on. These minions, for whatever reason, had decided to put on the first season of Apple TV's TV series. I don't even know what to call your series anymore. I mean, they're streaming series, I guess. And I guess y'all do still technically have televisions, although they're basically glorified computers with these massive monitors bolted onto the front of them. But anyways, yes, Apple TV's TV series called For All Mankind. Now, honestly, I do have to enjoy and appreciate and give them credit for the title. It is a great title. In fact, the title was listed wholesale from the plaque left on the moon by the crew of Apollo 11, which some of it reads, "We came in peace for all mankind." Now, in this particular universe, in the storyline of the For All Mankind series, Apollo 11 did not actually leave a plaque. That actually was a detail in, I think, the second episode. But that's where things get interesting. Because, you see, the reason that Apollo 11 in For All Mankind's universe didn't leave a plaque is because the whole thing reads as, quote, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." End quote. And the problem is, in the For All Mankind universe, they were not first, so the plaque didn't make any sense anymore. So who was first, you ask? Well, I mean, the answer is obvious if you had paid attention to that part of humanity's history. In the For All Mankind storyline, the first human to set foot on the moon was in fact a Soviet. And he did so in a stereotypical fashion for the Leninist Marxist way of life. Gag me with a data spike. But wait a second, how did the Soviets pull this off? Because in your timeline, the Soviet manned lunar expedition program was a catastrophic disaster. So how did this happen? The show actually doesn't specify, as far as I've been able to determine yet, but I haven't gotten that far because, unfortunately, the show specified that by using an Earth orbit rendezvous program involving 2 successful N-1 rocket launches, the Soviets were able to beat the USAians to the moon. And that's when I started laughing hard enough that ships started falling out of the shipyards. No, never in a million years. No. Oh, great maker. But the real problem with this episode is, where do I start it? I mean, it's all a catastrophic failure from stem to stern, but where do I start the story? I can't go all the way back to the beginning because that would take way too long and you wouldn't sit through it. So we're definitely going to take a concatenated aspect view perspective on this whole thing. To start with, on July 29th, 1955, the United States announced that they had an intention of launching an artificial satellite during the period between, July 57 and December 1958. They didn't actually meet that deadline. But a month later, the Soviet Union, the USSR, approved launching a satellite, a 1-ton satellite at that, using the R-7 ICBM, which is a notable vehicle Because it is, in fact, the first intercontinental ballistic missile ever made. Yes, in fact, the Soviets beat the USAians to the concept of an intercontinental ballistic missile, just right off the bat. I mean, the Soviets actually used their ICBM platform for launching a whole pile of stuff into orbit, because they massively over-engineered it, as the Soviets always do, and they just kept reusing the platform. Worked great. Why deviate from it? Anyways, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyways, yes, like I said, back in 1955, on July 29th, the USAians announced the start of the space race. And despite what you've heard, this is not, in fact, the brainchild of a certain John F. Kennedy Jr. or whatever. No, in fact, the space race itself is a byproduct of Dwight D. Eisenhower as the President of the United States of America. Now, yes, technically Kennedy did define the space race in a more concatenated fashion as being the race to the moon, which we'll get into in just a few moments. But suffice to say, the space race actually predated him, which is an interesting detail, given that Kennedy was one of the strongest proponents of the race to space, or more specifically, the race to moon. And can you blame him? I mean, you squishies leaving your globe is kind of a big deal. Go for it. But anyways, like I said, the space race was kicked off on July 29, 1955. And then the Soviets, who of course never technically acknowledged that they were abiding by the terms of the space race. They were not actually playing on space race terms. They were just going into space on their own. They weren't trying to get in a competition with the USAians. They were just doing space things on their own that the USAians knew nothing about, and it's all fine because they weren't in a competition. They were never in a competition, because you want to know one of the big, functional, huge details of the space race or the race to the moon? Yeah. The space race and the race to the moon were individually meant to be massive banners for the USAians, massive accomplishments for your United States of America to be like the first person on the moon, the first person in space. They didn't make that checkpoint, but that's not the point. The point was to be bigger, be better, be stronger, be faster, be whatever. Well, that's the official explanation. The unofficial explanation is that Eisenhower announcing the start of the space race and then Kennedy doubling down on it were meant to economically destroy the Soviet Union. Because, of course, the Soviet Union could not allow these USAian freedom-loving f***ers to be first in space. They couldn't allow them to be first on the moon. They couldn't allow them to be anything. The Soviets always had to be first, because the Soviet mentality, the Soviet system was so much better than the capitalist, cronyist, corporatist system that the United States had then and still has now. Or at least that's what they told themselves. Of course, history has proven that their system did not work that well and was not better in the end, but that's neither here nor there for politicians of the time. And yes, it was a whole posturing bullshit thing. The space race, yes, was meant to get a USAian person in space and a USAian person on the moon. But it was also meant to taunt the USSR folks into trying to beat them. And the funny thing is that the USSR beat the USAians on most checkpoints. Remind me which country is still around, though. So who won in the end? Although here I am talking about a race and a checkpoint and all the rest of those details, and I'm not actually giving you the story of the race. After all, like I said, on July 29th, 1955, the USAians announced the start of the race. And then in 1955, on August 30th, literally just barely over a month later, the Soviets announced that they were going to launch a satellite into space, a 1-ton satellite, in fact. And then, just literally 2 years later, the Soviets actually finished building the literal first ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, in the world. It's the R-7 Semyorka. And then, just literally 2 months later, They actually launched the first artificial satellite around your globe, and that satellite provided the first man-made signals from orbit. And she was, of course, called Sputnik, the very first artificial body in orbit around your world was sent up by Marxists. How unfortunate is that? And just a literal month later, in 1957, on November 3rd, the Soviets sent up the first mammal in orbit around Earth, a dog named Laika. This is a sad story. Laika didn't survive the experience. Laika wasn't meant to survive the experience. The Soviets didn't care. Yeah, we're not going to touch on this very long. Because in March of the following year, the USAians finally put up something notable, the first solar-powered satellite. Good job, guys. I mean, you're only, 6 months behind the first satellite in orbit around the planet? At least it's solar-powered now? Good job. But, again, putting up numbers, a year later, in January of 1959, the Soviets actually did the first lunar flyby. And they actually got the first photos of the moon, of the far side of your moon, by way of a satellite, a remotely operated vehicle. And in fact, Luna 1 is the very first object you squishies ever made that achieved Earth escape velocity. It left the orbit of your planet. Now, it didn't leave the solar system. It's currently orbiting your sun somewhere between Earth and Mars. But still, it was the first thing that actually successfully escaped the grasp of your homeworld. Predictably, after Luna 1, things kind of took off in the space race, what with the USAians getting the first photograph of Earth from orbit in August of 1959. Yes, you heard that right. You actually had a photograph of the moon from space before you had a photograph of Earth from space. Clearly, priorities got a little whack there somewhere in the middle. And then September of 1959 brought the first hard landing on another celestial body, by way of Luna 2, and the Soviets put another one up on the board. And of course, hard landing means exactly that. It went smack. It was mostly meant to, but yeah, really hard landing. Then just a month later, in October of 1959, Luna 3 performed the very first gravity slingshot to bring back photos from the far side of the moon, actually achieving 70% coverage. So yet another win for the Soviets. Then some time passed, and the USAians did something a lot crazy in August of 1960. This was the first time that an object returning from Earth's orbit was aerially recovered. Yeah, you heard that right. Apparently, Discoverer 14 was the very first spy satellite put into orbit, and she dropped her photography payload, and it was picked up by way of a C-117 trailing basically a trapeze assembly and snagging the parachute. Because, USAians can't never do something simple, right? But that all got overshadowed when the very first plants and animals were able to be returned alive from space the very next day. The dogs Belka and Strelka. And yes, the Soviets actually recovered the dogs this time. How kind of them. Not to be outdone, though, in January of 1961, USAians managed to put up the first great ape or hominid in space, Ham. He was recovered, and he spent most of his retirement at the National Zoo in D.C. Of course, the Soviets couldn't let that stand, and in April of 1961, history was made. Yuri Gagarin spent his entire life training, practicing, becoming a better human, all to simply be able to spend a measly 2 hours outside of the United Soviet Socialist Republics. However, in his Vostok spacecraft atop, yes, still an R-7 rocket, the Soviets are still using them at this point, he did in fact become the first human being in space. That's a hell of a score to put on the board for the Soviets. Now, just a month later, in May of 1961, the USAians also managed to put a human into orbit on the first pilot-controlled spaceflight. The Vostok mission was actually computer-controlled, whereas Alan Shepard was in charge of Freedom 7 during its flight, but still, second place. Ouch. And then after that, things got even more crazy and wild. For example, in May of 1961, there was the first planetary flyby. Although technically the Soviets lost contact with the vehicle, so it didn't really, honestly, count. And then thereafter, of course, the USAians couldn't allow that to stand, and in December of 1962, they did the first successful planetary flyby mission, period, and maintained communication with the vehicle as it went past Venus. The previous Soviet mission meant to go past Venus as well. It just lost contact, and the USA maintained contact throughout the entire flight. But then the Soviets, not to be outdone yet again, in June of 1963, put the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space. In fact, she is also the first civilian in space, which is notable because most astronauts and or cosmonauts were military members before they became, astronauts and or cosmonauts. She was a straight up normie, and also she was a she. So again, big mark for the Soviets. And then just 3 days later, still in June of 1963, the Soviets tried to launch a vehicle past Mars and then lost contact again. This seems to be a common theme with them. Could you guys maintain contact? Goddamn Soviets. But hey, the next month, in July of 1963, the first reusable piloted spacecraft and the very first space plane was flown by the USAians. Technically, it was a suborbital flight, but it still counts, and the X-15 will go down in history as one of the most remarkable aircraft, spacecraft, whatever you want to call them, in history. And then, just 7 days later in July, the first geosynchronous satellite was launched by the USAians. And then just a little over a year later, the very first geostationary satellite was also launched by the USAians in August of 1964. However, not to be outdone yet again, the Soviets in March of 1965 performed the very first extravehicular activity, otherwise known as a spacewalk, by way of the Voskhod 2 mission. Yeah, they had a Huey outside of a vehicle. Ain't that crazy? And then, just as yet another example of the USAians doing what the Soviets couldn't quite accomplish, in July of 1965, there was the first successful Mars flyby mission where they didn't actually lose signal with the craft. Good job, USAians. However, not to be outdone, if you remember how Luna 1 was the first hard landing on another celestial body, Luna 9 was the first actual soft landing on another celestial body, in fact, your moon. And it was the first photos sent from another celestial body. It was the first vehicle you actually landed on another body in your solar system, anywhere at all. And the Soviets were able to chalk that one up too. And that, in fact, happened in February of 1966, but since the Soviets were not quite done yet, in March of 1966, they went and splatted something on Venus. The first hard landing on another planet was by way of Venera 3. Venera sounds kind of awkward in English language, doesn't it? How strange. But later in March of 1966, the USAians were able to accomplish the first spacecraft docking between Gemini 8 and ATV. What is ATV, you ask? That is a great question. The answer is it stands for the Agena Target Vehicle, otherwise known as the Gemini Agena Target Vehicle. And no, I adamantly, vociferously, strongly object to NASA's pronunciation of Gemini. I understand it's an inside joke. I understand it's a sign of you are part of the inside group. You're part of us if you say it the wrong way. But they are, in fact, saying it the wrong way. The term is Gemini. It will always be Gemini. It was Gemini when the ancient Grecians said it. It is Gemini now. If they want to say it is Gemini, they're morons, and that's fine. Anyways, the ATV was literally a docking training vehicle. It was just an unmanned blob up there in space that the USAians could practice docking against. It was a no-cost docking endeavor. And it actually taught them a great deal about how to dock to vehicles. But that's a whole separate conversation. Later that year, in the April of 1966, the Soviets were able to put up the first artificial satellite to orbit another celestial body. Naturally, this was Luna 10, and she orbited the moon. And in September of 1968, the Soviets put up the win of putting a vehicle, Zond 5, that carried, 2 tortoises, fruit fly eggs, and plants on a loop around the moon and then back to your planet to be successfully recovered again. The Soviet scientists wanted to see what happened to them. But this was notable because it was the very first vehicle to return to the Earth after circling the moon and the very first life forms to circle the moon and return safely. And then, just a few months later, in December of 1968, Apollo 8 decided to not only circle the moon, they decided to orbit the moon. And it was, in fact, the first human spaceflight to ever enter the gravitational influence of another celestial body. They literally orbited the moon. And then, in January of 1969, the Soviets decided to hang out their, gonads and do the first crew exchange in space. They in fact docked Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5 and had the very first people moving between vehicles and getting back into the vehicles and going back home kind of thing. An honest-to-God crew exchange in space. And I would just like to take a moment here because this is somewhat notable. The Soyuz 4 and Soyuz 5 capsules were both launched into space by, yes, once again, the R-7 Semyorka, the ICBM that the Soviets developed many, many, many years ago at this point. And yes, the Soyuz 4 and the Soyuz 5 capsules are basically the exact same Soyuz 7K TAC-OK capsules that the International Space Station still uses as one of their descent vehicles and one of their supply vehicles. The design has not significantly, massively changed. Can we talk about how the Soviets decide on one thing and just don't ever deviate from that pattern? Maybe in a different episode. And then, just 6 months later in 1969, we all know what happened. On July 20th, 1969, the USAians, by way of Apollo 11, put the very first humans on the moon. Your moon. The very first humans to walk, to stand, to do whatever on a celestial body that was not your planet. And by most metrics, that was basically the end of the space race. Now, I mean, by most metrics, I mean John F. Kennedy Jr.'s metrics. He changed the space race to the race to the moon. And yes, technically the space race continued until December 31st, 1991, when the USSR dissolved. And I guess technically the Soviets actually got the final win in the end by having the first consistently inhabited long-term research space station in February of 1990, and of course that is Mir. But really, landing humans on the moon was the whole point. And they never really trumped that. I mean, yes, the USSR sent out probes and rovers and vehicles and observers and satellites and all these other things, but really, landing a person on the moon was the point. And once that happened, the USSR gave up. Which is why the USAians gave up as well. I mean, yeah, of course, the USAians shifted to the space shuttle program, which was always low Earth orbit limited and wasn't supposed to do anything other than, satellite stuff, station stuff. It wasn't supposed to go back out to the moon. It wasn't supposed to expand the USAian empire. Of course not. because their greatest competitor gave up. So there's no more competition. There was no reason to fight anymore. There was no reason to push anymore. Which is really a goddamn shame, isn't it? But in all these checkpoints, and all these Soviet wins, and all these USAian wins, and all these various attempts, you want to know something that I haven't mentioned? A successful N-1 rocket launch. Why have I not mentioned a successful N-1 rocket launch? I mean, I've glossed over the vehicular details of most of these things. I've only specified because it's funny that the Soviets keep reusing their ICBM platform to launch stuff into space. Maybe they did launch something with an N-1 at some point along the way, somewhere, blah, 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 so on and so forth. No, they fucking did not. I mean, technically, out of the 4 N-1 attempted launches, 3 were technically successful. By that, I mean the one that was not successful blew up on the pad and destroyed the pad and a significant chunk of the world around it. The other 3, none of them lasted in flight more than a minute. They all either blew up on their own or they were remotely destroyed because it was clear that they were never going to work. Which is the point. And yes, here I am 25 minutes into an episode, and I suppose I shall actually get to the point. Welcome to the channel. So why did the N-1 rockets in For All Mankind work, and in the real world, your world, they did not? Well, the common contention is that Sergei Korolev was not killed on the operating table in For All Mankind. Well, he didn't die on the operating table. The particulars of his death in your world are somewhat contentious in a predictable fashion given the USSR. So who was this guy anyways? I mean, seriously? Well, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev is pretty much the only reason the USSR ever got into space. And he has a predictably horrible history given, again, the USSR. He was born in what is now Ukraine and showed a very solid interest at a very early age in gliders of all things. And in his university program, he was actually mentored by Andrei Tupolev, which is a name that anyone on your planet with even the vaguest interest in aircraft should know. After he graduated, he kept on with the glider motif for a little while and then got really interested in rocketry. And in fact was basically a founding member of the Group for the Study of Reactive Motion, which is the Soviet Union's first attempt at having a study group for actual rockets. And then in 1937, that all went to shit. At that point, Joseph Stalin decided to do his Great Purge, and thanks to forced false confessions from his superiors and friends, Sergei was arrested by the NKVD on trumped-up and fake charges and spent months in a gulag and years in a prison. His friends and family claim that he basically never recovered, which is not entirely far off base given the injuries and malnutrition he suffered specifically at the Gulag. Again, classic USSR fashion. However, finally, years later, the bureaucrats finally dug their heads out of their nether regions and basically discharged him by special governmental decree, although the charges against him still lasted for years after that and were finally dropped. Once again, classic USSR fashion. It was probably some Damocles sword dangling over his head and ensuring he behaved, which again is somewhat upheld by his behavior after his release. Anyways, moving on, in 1945, Korolev was brought by the USSR into Germany and helped resurrect their V-2 program there. I mean, not resurrected, the Soviets took ownership of it and built their own V-2 rockets, with Korolev helping along the way. And on the basic premise of the V-2, Korolev and the rest of his team that he was part of started work on the R-1, which then became the R2, and then didn't quite become the R3, and then the R5 happened, and then years later, finally, yes, you all know what's coming, because I talked about it already. In 1957, the R7 Semyorka became the very first ICBM on your world, all not entirely, but mostly thanks to Korolev's work. And the USSR, in their infinite generosity and magnanimity, finally, after the R7 was actually done and working, mind you, admitted that the charges against him were entirely wrong and he was fully rehabilitated now. How kind of them. Anyways, since the R7 was the entire backbone of the Soviet space program, he naturally was a key part, significant element of it as it continued. In fact, it was his design that gave birth to the Luna series of probes that the Soviets flung at the moon, although I would point out that he referred to them as mekta, which is the Russian word meaning dream. Much better name, but Luna I guess makes more sense given the mission parameters. However, a significant detail that I did omit in the Luna series of numbering that will be relevant here just momentarily is that the Soviets only named successful missions. Or at the very least, missions that got them big enough publicity, because technically Luna 1 was a failure. She was supposed to hit. She missed, but they still got the vehicle out there, so they counted that one as Luna 1. But see, Luna 1 was technically the fourth launch of the E-1 system, which was Korolev's platform for getting a probe to the moon. The first three failed to orbit. The fourth one technically failed too, but again, it got them enough publicity, they went ahead and named it. Fifth one failed. Sixth one was success. Seventh one was a success. Those were Luna 2 and 3. 8, 9, 10, and 11 all failed. 12 worked out well enough that it got named Luna 4, and so on and so forth. Now, I am certainly not going to say that the USA and NASA had a perfect glowing record. Of course they didn't. They had their own series of catastrophic failures and explosions and all the other usual things that you would expect when you strap a small payload on top of a tower of high explosive chemicals. However, as much as Korolev was functionally the Wernher von Braun for the USSRians, his surviving on the operating table all those decades ago wouldn't have solved the other problems plaguing the Soviet manned space mission program, the space mission program in general. And here's why. To begin with, this was a race after all, and this was at the very beginning of the race before the Soviets had actually been able to put up the big wins of getting that object out past the moon or putting a dog in space or putting a human in space. This was that very beginning, and they wanted to save face by putting up a good show. So poor frickin' Korolev was always rushed. He was always pushed, he was always rushed, he was always harried. They were never happy with whatever timeline he provided to the Soviet higher-ups. But despite the fact of the importance of the space race to both countries, the unfortunate reality of using the R7 as both the launch vehicle and an ICBM also took a toll on the system. The ICBM aspect of it was, well, obviously more important to the Soviets during the beginning of the Cold War, especially since they had the first one. That had to work, then that had to be the priority for the vehicle. And oh yeah, Korolev can go play with the spare leftovers we have, which naturally were not as well built as the ones used for the ICBM program. And then on top of that, the changes necessary to the R7 to convert it from an ICBM to an actual launch vehicle caused their own problems. Notably, the Block D strap-on boosters, the four big bulges on the bottom half of the R7 rocket, really didn't like the additional superstructure that had to be added to support the additional payload, and they tended to produce high-frequency vibrations in their combustion chambers. Naturally, combustion chambers do not appreciate being vibrated at high frequencies. And sure, all of this is fixable, and all of this, well, most of this was eventually fixed, but this again is the symptom of the rush, the push, the constant hassling of Korolev to get something out the door. Even if it explodes on the way, it was still out the door. And yeah, he absolutely did his best to manage that, but clearly he couldn't stop it. Which, again, he wouldn't have been able to stop it even if he had stayed alive after that operation. Especially since the whole Apollo program threw a massive monkey in the Soviet Union's wrench. As soon as that got announced, they started having to scramble and figure out what the hell they were going to do. And thankfully, Korolev had been wanting to go to the moon and beyond since very early in his old, rocket career. Again, the comparisons between him and von Braun are not entirely unreasonable. And had the idea of what would become the N-1 already in mind and probably even planned out. So going from zero to, hey, we have a rocket, was a little easier. Unfortunately, it wasn't perfectly simple, though, because naturally there were competing agencies and competing plans to try and come up with an idea that would keep the USSR bureaucrats happy. While Korolev's design bureau got the final nod, Vladimir Chalamet's design bureau was also out there fighting for their particular design known as the Universal Rocket Series. The competition between the two is obviously outside of the scope of this particular episode, but suffice to say there was animosity, competition, and just general purpose political backstabbing between the two design agencies, which of course got in the way of everything else. Along the way, during the same time period, Nikita Khrushchev was replaced by Alexei Kosygin as the premier of the Soviet Union. And perhaps, more importantly, given the USSR, Khrushchev was also replaced at the same time in 1964 by Leonid Brezhnev as the Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, again, the politics of the USSR is way outside the scope of this episode and this channel, but I am sure it's an interesting conversation as to which position held more power. Anyways, when you go from one guy holding both positions to two new guys holding either position, whatever, I'm sure the situation got weird, funding got reallocated, politics got a lot more exciting, and all this, of course, kept getting in the way. And speaking of dates, let's not forget that the Apollo program was announced by John F. Kennedy Jr. in 1961, and the N-1 program didn't officially start until 1963, which again rushed the schedules. The Soviets had to catch up by 2 years. That wasn't going to happen. Now, like I mentioned, Korolev had been sketching and planning this kind of thing starting in 1959, but still it was just kind of like a side project, not something that he actually had any funding to do anything with. They weren't planning on actually doing any testing until 1965. And speaking of testing, oh, great maker. All right, to back up a little, I'm sure you guys have some kind of concept of how liquid rocket engines work. You take your oxidizer, you take your fuel, you mix them up in the combustion chamber, you light a match, and off you go. Well, unfortunately, rocket engines are a lot more complicated than that, as you might figure, and the N-1 rocket was hampered by that more complex concept. It was powered by what was technically the second staged combustion cycle liquid rocket engine ever produced. That is to say, the NK-15. Now, the NK actually stands for Nikolai Kuznetsov, who was the head of the Kuznetsov Design Bureau. Now, you'll notice that's not the Korolev Design Bureau, which is yet another problem with this whole program. There were lots of arguments and lots of contention and lots of political pressure and backstabbing and so on and so forth between all these design bureaus, even when they were supposed to be working together. But anyways, the NK-33, and for that matter, a staged combustion cycle. Basically what that means is the propellant goes through multiple combustion chambers and is thus combusted in stages. Typically a small portion of the propellant, typically fuel-rich, is ignited in what's called a preburner, and then the gases coming off of that are used to power turbopumps to actually provide the fuel and oxidizer to the engine, and then those gases are directed into the main combustion chamber where the rest of the fuel and oxidizer are all combusted all at once. This is technically a more efficient design than most other rocket engines, especially the standard dump the fuel in the oxidizer, light a match, and run like hell's design, but it naturally is significantly more complex. And this was the problem. But I guess before we get to the actual problem, we should back up a little, because the engine was actually a huge conversation in the USSR about what kind of engine to actually use. Because you see, in the United Soviet Socialist Republic, there was an absolute king of rocket engine design, known otherwise as Valentin Glushko, who loved him some hypergolic fuels. What is a hypergolic fuel, you ask? Basically, you take chemical A and you take chemical B and you mix them and they spontaneously ignite. That's all it takes. No sparks, no flame source, no nothing. Just simply mixing those two chemicals causes them to combust and poof, there's a rocket. Or an explosion, depending on how you actually use the hypergolic aspects. And technically, Glushko's designs are massively more efficient than basically any other design out there. However, It's really unclear whether Korolev was affected by the Apollo 1 fire or not, but the fact remains that Korolev was absolutely adamant that these kinds of toxic and otherwise dangerous fuels were not something he was interested in. And the interesting thing is that he actually focused on the toxic aspect as opposed to the spontaneously explosive aspect, which I'm really curious about that. I mean, yes, technically Glushko's engines relied on unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, neither of which are good for you squishy humans. But this is one of the many times when I wish the Soviet concept of glasnost was a little more glasnosty. And for those of y'all who don't understand that particular term, and I won't blame you if you don't, because it's actually a pretty old term, and specifically a Russian term, and I don't know how many of you actually speak Russian in my audience. Most of y'all seem to be from the USAN area, but anyways, glasnost is a pretty old thing in the USSR, but most specifically, it is a thing that came by way of Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, who I am sure all of you squishy humans know by way of the birthmark on his forehead, but is basically the way that the Soviet Union tried to be a little more open about how they did things and why they did things and where they did things and when they did things. It is a pale imitation of the whole Freedom of Information Act that the USAians have in your particular province. Glasnost is just simply the USSR saying that we're going to release this small amount of information and hopefully it'll appease you idiots and maybe you'll go away and stop bothering us. Now, a lot of information came out in that particular movement, but it wasn't actually useful information, which, signal to noise, jamming, it all makes sense in the end. I'm sorry, I'm falling off track. My point is that Korolev's insistence against using toxic fuels is fascinating. He wasn't concerned about the spontaneous boom. He was concerned about the toxic aspect for the humies. And I can't help but to feel that was some sort of avoidance of what he was actually concerned about. Or it was simply a political game because he and Glushko did not get along. So maybe he was just emphasizing the toxic nature of the fuels so he could do his engines, as opposed to this asshole Glushko who kept getting in his way. It's hard to say, because again, the Soviets were never good with records, and certainly never good at releasing them to sophonts like me or you or anyone else, which is a goddamn shame. There's a massive amount of history that would be absolutely fascinating if we could ever get an actual sanitized version out of the Russians. Never gonna happen, sadly. Anywho, after Korolev told Glushko to, fornicate in a fire and expire, I don't know if that's actually what he said, but that was basically the point of what he said. Korolev went to speak to a certain individual by the name of Nikolai Kuznetsov. Now, what's interesting is Nikolai Kuznetsov is a terribly common Russian name, and I can't actually track down which Nikolai Kuznetsov he talked to. But the fact remained, this particular Nikolai had never designed a rocket engine before, so he went with the brute force method, in that designing large rocket engines is hard, but designing small rocket engines is not hard. So, by dint of that, the N-1 rocket had 30 rocket engines on its first stage. Yes, you heard that right, 30. Which leads us back to the problem of testing, because you see, the problem with these particular rocket engines is that they were explosively closed. Apparently this was a method of simplifying the mechanical aspects of the engine. The valves necessary to open and close them were mechanically opened and then explosively closed. They used some sort of pyrotechnic charge to ensure that when the valve needed to be closed, it was closed. So there was no dialing down the output of an engine, Once the engine was open, it was open. And once you opened it to a certain point, it was open to that certain point. You could only open it further or you could turn it off. There was nothing in between. And more importantly, once the engine was turned off, explosively turned off, pyrotechnically turned off, you had to send it back to the factory to get it fixed again. You couldn't replace a pyrotechnic charge and open up the valve and whatever, this, that, and the other. No. It had to go back to the factory again and be recycled. Hold on. That means you couldn't actually static test fire any engine, because any engine you static test fire has to go back to the manufacturer to be recycled and rebuilt, because you turned it off and now you blew the pyrotechnic charge and it has to be rebuilt again. Are we seeing a problem now? See, one of the core elements of going to space today, as your Elon Musk keeps informing you over and over again, is testing. And sometimes testing doesn't go great. In fact, most times testing doesn't go great. And that's the point. Testing gets the problems out of the way. Well, when you can't actually test an engine, that's hard to get things out of the way, isn't it? And I guess I should be fair to the Soviets and say, yes, in fact, you could, in fact, test that singular solitary engine. And if that singular solitary engine worked just fine, then great. You can send it back to the manufacturer, and they can refurbish it, and they can rebuild it with typical Soviet quality. And when you get it back, who the knows? Which is really the point. The point is that at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan, in the former United Soviet Socialist Republic area, they got deliveries of 6 engines at a time. 6, again, NK-15 engines. And they tested 2 of them. And if 2 of them passed, then they assumed the other 4 were good to go. And if only 1 of them passed, well, they weren't really sure what to do. And if both of them failed, well, they sent the whole batch back. But this is again the problem. Because frankly, the Soviet quality control and quality assurance program was shit! It was horrible! It was unquestionably monstrous. They were shipping just absolute nonsense in the name of shipping it, because they had to ship something, right? Otherwise they'd be sent to the gulag. It was not great. And hey, maybe the 2 engines we tested at Baikonur were earmarked specifically because they could be tested and were testable and would probably test okay. And I'm sure there wasn't anything shoved under the table to the person doing the testing to ensure that those particular 2 engines were tested. No, of course not. That would never happen in the honorable USSR. Of course not. But see, now you're starting to scratch away at why Korolev surviving wouldn't have made a f***ing difference. Is because he was always shortchanged. He was never as funded as the Apollo program was. Not even in comparative US dollars versus USSR rubles or whatever the they were using at the time. It doesn't matter. He did not have equivalent amounts of money. He didn't even have close to the same amount of money. Depending on what kind of exchange programs you're using, he had somewhere between 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 amounts of money. He was behind by either 2/3 or 4/5, depending on how you want to count the math. There's no way of catching up from that. And then beyond that, his design choices were reasonable, honestly, given your history. I mean, you Humies had a bad history with hypergolic fuels, and I understand why he decided to shy away from that. But beyond that, he was faced with the quality control and quality assurance failures that was the USSR. They couldn't produce something good to save their fucking lives. And sadly, more often than not, Their lives did depend on it, and it wasn't actually their fault that the product failed, but it was still their life on the line. It was a bad system. I don't know why anyone simps for the USSR, but that's not my point of the channel. My point is that having an engine that is basically untestable is a fucking problem. Yes, you can randomly take engines out of the product line and test them and see if they work. That's great. That's not the same as testing the engine you're about to send into orbit. Because the Soviets couldn't. They literally could not test the engine that they were sending into orbit. They could test the engine next to the engine they were sending into orbit and assume that it worked the same, but there's no guarantee, especially in the USSR. In fact, the staged combustion cycle was such a new thing that you would think you would test it, and then you make an engine that can't be tested. Why would you do that? Okay, fine. I think at this point I've belabored the whole testing of the engines thing enough, or I guess lack thereof, technically. I suppose I should move on to the next failure point of the N-1 rocket system, otherwise known as the KORD. K-O-R-D, Kilo Oscar Romeo Delta. Apparently in Cyrillic, that is the acronym for the Russian translation of Control of Rocket Engines. Unfortunately, as you might imagine, it was not particularly good at controlling much of anything. This computer, and I'm using that term very loosely, was intended to actually manage the engines, and on the first launch it decided to turn off 2 of the engines for no apparent reason. This may or may not have led to a pogo oscillation in other engines, which broke a fuel line and caused the entire thing to be shut down by the KORD because it detected entirely out of parameter situations. And of course, when you shut down all the engines on a launching rocket, it falls out of the sky. Second time around, the rocket launched, and about at 300 feet or so, pieces started falling off of it, and the KORD turned off everything except one engine, because that makes sense. And then the rocket tilted sideways, fell over, and made an explosion big enough for the history books. Third time, the rocket launched the pad, and it started rolling, as rockets do to get on the right trajectory, only it kept rolling, and it kept rolling faster and faster. The KORD noticed this, oddly enough, and attempted to shut things down, but a programming update had prevented it from doing anything until T plus 50 seconds after launch. So, naturally, at T48, the roll was so bad that the vehicle simply disintegrated in midair. Apparently, pieces were able to get up to 9 miles away from the launch sites thanks to not allowing the KORD to do its job in the first 50 seconds of the flight. And this, naturally, is not something that Korolev could have fixed. Certainly not by himself, and especially not since he was around for the first launch. I mean, these are integral problems in the system that they were designing, and they simply did not work right. And just to loop out all the actual crashes and launches, since it's the same number of the N-1 program, the fourth launch actually did pretty well, at least in comparison to its predecessors. At T plus 90 seconds after launch, as the vehicle was passing through max Q, which is basically the max aerodynamic drag that the vehicle will have on its way to space, the central engine cluster on the first stage naturally shut down. On other rockets, they throttled down as opposed to simply shutting down, but like we talked about previously with the NK-15 engines, you couldn't throttle them down. They were either throttling up or turned off, and that was it. So they shut down, which caused a hydraulic shock wave through the first stage engine, causing one of the engines to explode. At T plus 107 seconds, basically the entire vehicle came apart, and amusingly, the emergency escape system actually pulled the upper stages away safely, so at least that worked. But again, since they couldn't test the all-up engines all installed together on a static test fire and see what would happen when they just randomly shut down the central section of the engines, they didn't know that was going to happen. Another thing that Korolev, if he were still alive, simply could not have fixed. They didn't know what they didn't know. This was going to happen at some point for some launch. And just be thankful that all of their launches were unmanned. And just to clarify something that amuses me to no end, yes, the N-1's first stage was comprised of 30 NK-15 engines, as we mentioned previously. There were 6 in a central cluster and then 24 arrayed around the edge. At the time, and for the longest time, that made it the rocket with the largest number of engines on the first stage. Until a certain Elon Musk showed up and SpaceX decided that the Super Heavy's first stage would in fact have 33 Raptors on its first stage. I can't help but to believe that was mostly Elon's doing just so he could take the title away from the Soviets. Okay. I suppose I should back up and clarify my contention about all of the inefficiencies, poor design, poor quality control, poor production, and just general purpose problems that just fraught the N-1 program from beginning to its ignoble end. Could Korolev fixed some of those, most of them even, if he had somehow survived his untimely and perhaps deliberate demise? Probably. I mean, if nothing else, as an example, the NK-15 engine was later replaced by the NK-33 on what was supposed to be the next generation N-1 rocket, and you're still using the NK-33 today. Granted, it's been improved and modified and tweaked a little around the edges, but it is still in service. In other words, it works. And could the cord have been fixed? I mean, I guess with enough iterations of crashing N-1s into the ground, anything can be fixed if you actually pay attention to why they're crashing. But the real problem, and the reason why simply him being alive wouldn't be enough, is he didn't have the time or money to do either. He was behind the 8-ball, as you Humies say, from the very beginning, and there was simply no chance of him catching up with the Apollo program, much less effectively competing with it. And yet, for some reason, For All Mankind puts them having launched a successful lunar mission, including 2 successful N-1 launches, 2 weeks before Apollo 11 even got off the ground. There's just no way. The systemic, perhaps endemic political infighting, poor construction, and just general purpose lack of funding was never going to allow that to happen. There would have had to have been massive cultural and financial shifts decades before the series of events in For All Mankind for them to have been able to pull this off. And admittedly, that isn't the story the writers were planning on telling, so they just glossed right over those details, but it is still somewhat fundamentally frustrating. The trick with alt history is that you're telling a different history from the one that people imagine, so you have to pick some sort of departure point and/or reason as to why it is different. And big events are typically easy in this particular case. For example, what if Japan never bombed Pearl Harbor? Things would be very different today. But not to discredit the accomplishments of Mr. Korolev and his ultimate genius, because as far as the Soviets and Russians have been willing to tell us, he was a pretty smart dude. But I just don't see his presence being the only significant change that would have been necessary for All Mankind's universe to have happened. Granted, some other changes happened in the background, given that a number of their characters were based off of real Apollo astronauts, but were not real Apollo astronauts themselves. So some stuff in the timeline got mixed around a little before Korolev survived on the operating table, but still. It would have been an interesting 30-second montage as they covered a series of events that happened entirely differently in your universe decades before the events of For All Mankind, just to set you up for the situation. I mean, they do those montage things to catch you up between seasons as to what was going on in the world, but they kind of needed like a preface one or something like that. Or I just missed it as all the things flipped by, and I'm so unfamiliar with your history that I missed one of the key elements. It's entirely possible. So all that said, and I realize that I have said a lot at this point, I have no significant complaints with For All Mankind as it sits encapsulated by the actual TV series itself. We will, of course, loop back to talk about some of the vehicles used in it, but it shows a great alternate history of where you could be now. Now you are slowly catching up with where you could be, mostly thanks to private enterprise, but you could have been there all along, and it's a damn shame you aren't. But hey, as with all alternate history stories, take a look at the different choices made in them and how they might have influenced your future then, your present now, and maybe make some different choices today. Who knows what can happen? And that's all from Sacred Cow Shipyards. Please be advised that any ship left on the docks for more than 24 hours will be compressed to a cube at the owner's expense. Have a nice day.